Welcome to Module 17. Module 17, to some degree, picks up where the previous chapter left off, in that we're still talking about ways to communicate with the end user above and beyond simply an HTML page. In chapter 16, we looked at explanations, how we can produce clickable zones that let the user drill down into the reasoning why or why not a particular outcome was met. In Module 17, we're going to actually see again the notion of explanation. But let's dial down that for a moment and talk about the subject in hand. Forms. Forms in Intelligent Advisor. What are they and why do we need them? Forms, in my opinion, this is an example of something that the name confuses people, because I've often had people come up to me and say, well, Richard, an Intelligent Advisor interview is like a form anyway. So what is a form? We'll talk about what it is, how you make one, and how you then share that with the end user. So let's start with the really easy stuff. What is a form? A form is a PDF file or another standard format. There are a couple of other formats, but the most common one that is requested is a PDF file that is generated as part of your interview experience and then is offered to the end user for download. So I'm sure you're familiar with this sort of thing. You're on the internet and you fill in a form or you fill in lots of data and you submit it all, maybe you sign it electronically, and then they say, would you like to download a copy of your contract? Or we will email you a copy of your contract. And it'll be everything that you entered on the website in a PDF format. That's exactly what this is. So I get why it's called a form. It's turning your interview into a PDF file, because when you have to enter data in a form, it's useful to have it in a PDF format. I keep using PDF as an example, but as we'll see, there are other formats available. Step by step, how do I create a form? Well, I make sure that I'm in policy modeling. I go to the project tab and I go to the forms sub-tab. And I create a new form by clicking the new button. And I want you to notice three things on this page. First of all, obviously, you're going to have to come up with a decent name, okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to name the template. And I want you to notice that this is a file name. So by the time we've finished manipulating this, there will be a physical file sitting in a forms directory on your hard drive, wherever your project is stored. And I want you to notice that right here, it says explanation. So we're going to be able to leverage explanations in our forms, as we'll see. You don't have to use explanations in a form. It's worthwhile mentioning that you don't need them, but it usually adds value to it. Technically speaking, when you click the new button over here, you actually get two choices. You can either create it using PDF directly. So if you are the happy owner of a license for Adobe PDF editor or any other commercial PDF editor that lets you create and edit PDFs, then you could use this option. The most common option, however, is you will use RTF. RTF is a format which is supported by Microsoft Word. And as we'll see, if you go down that route, you'll be able to use other features built into Oracle products to make your forms really easy. You can build them really easily using Microsoft Word. There are a couple of minor differences in terms of functionality, but for now we'll say that you choose whichever format you want based on whatever tools you have at your disposal. A word of reminder. This doesn't change what the end user is going to get. The end user is probably just going to get a PDF. But this is how you want to design the form yourself. And this has been introduced only a couple of versions ago. Is sometimes you want to have a PDF file that is global. Let me give you an example. You recall a few chapters ago, or even in an earlier chapter, we talked about the concept of an order, and that had order lines, and occasionally you had a free gift. Well, when you're going to build this PDF file, ask yourself the question, do I want one PDF file per order? Do I want one PDF file per shipment? Or do I just want one PDF file for the whole interview full stop. So that's where you're going to have to think about, well, what entity will be used for this form? Another simple example, if you have an entity called the family and a child entity called the family member, do you want to have a PDF file, one per family or one per family member? So this is where you'll have to decide. Global is the default, which assumes that you're going to have one PDF for the whole interview. So what do you put in a form? Well, to keep it nice and simple, we could say you can go into your editor of choice and you can write text. So you can say, "Dear customer, thank you for ordering today in our online shop. The following is a resume of what you ordered." So we could call that static text. You can write whatever you want. You can format it however you want. Bold, underline, it's just a form. Then you could add attribute data. You could say, okay, I'm going to add the name of the customer. So I could say, "Dear customer name." And I would replace customer name with the customer name at the time of generation. That would assume that I've done a little bit of configuration in my project for it to work properly, but it should be fairly obvious how it's going to work. Or I could say, well, let's explain to the pilot in this PDF file, let's explain why or why not they are authorized to fly our plane. So we would need to include an explanation in our PDF file. Notice the second point. These forms can also include images and can also include a signature. So if you've gone to the trouble of adding a signature panel so that I can sign your interview on the screen, that signature can be put into the form as well, which is useful when you need to create a kind of PDF copy of everything that was said and done during an interview. If you're just building an interview in one language, fine, you build a form to go with it. It's important to realize that if your interview is destined for multilingual use, and in another module we'll talk about how you do that, you would need to create, well, different forms, one for each language combination. So in this case, you'll see that I've gone to my hard drive and I've gone to the folder where my project is held, and there is a folder called Form Templates. This is the one that I created first because my project is in English United States. I then created a new folder called French France, FRFR, and I can actually just copy the ENUS and rename it so that I have a second version of the form. You can edit them both, and you can then use the French version when your interview is in French and the American version when your interview is in America. A few moments ago, I gave you a very simple example of a form. I said, "Dear customer name." It's a good one, right? The customer name, if you've ever done any mail merge or any kind of form letters that you sent out to your customers, this concept of a form field like "Dear customer name" is a form field. And we use a technique that we've already seen in previous modules, if you were watching them. You can go into your Oracle Policy Modeler and you can add a name to your attribute. We often call it the technical name because it's not something you would normally show to the end user. And that technical name is how you will reference this piece of information in your PDF form. So instead of saying "Dear Michael" or "Dear Steve," you would say "Dear customer name," because customer name would be the name you had given to one of your attributes. So here's a good piece of advice. Before you start working on a form, go through all of the attributes, entities, relationships, whatever it is that you plan on using in the form, make sure that you've given them a technical name. Saves you having to go backwards and forwards later. So let's assume that you've decided you want to have an explanation in your form. In your form, in your form, you will select the explanation button over here, and you will select one or more explanations to add to your form. As I repeat this one more time, you don't have to put explanations in here, but the likelihood is that at some point you will want to reproduce that clickable zone that you had at the end of the interview in a documented form. It'll make it easy for the citizen or the employee to understand why or why not they didn't meet those circumstances or didn't meet those criteria. So, now we come on to the mechanics of actually writing the form, or writing the document. You'll notice if you're eagle-eyed that this is a screenshot from Microsoft Word. So I went down the RTF route for this screenshot, and we're using a tool called BI Publisher Desktop. BI Publisher Desktop is simply an extra, I'll show you, it's an extra, get it right in the end. It's an extra toolbar which shows up in Microsoft Word, which assists you in the task of building a form. Technically speaking, it's actually part of a different product. It's not part of Intelligent Advisor. It's part of something called Oracle BI Publisher, which is why you'll hear people talking about Oracle BI Publisher when they're building a form for Intelligent Advisor. But we can put it simply like this, is if you choose RTF, when you create the form in Intelligent Advisor, you can then use Microsoft Word to build the form and take advantage of BI Publisher Desktop to help you position form fields and other specialized contents to make your form as interesting as possible. You'll notice, for example, here, conditional format, conditional region. So the toolbar will help you perform tasks like, let's create a document where certain components only show up under certain conditions. A conditional region. Let's say that, oh, when the pilot is not authorized, let's put that in red. So we'll create conditional formatting. You could do this yourself, but by having the toolbar, it takes away a lot of the complicated mechanics of knowing how to enter the details of a form field with exactly the right parameters so that it does what you want. When the interview is put in the hands of the end user, Intelligent Advisor takes care of taking this template, we could call it a template, taking this template and transforming it into a PDF and respecting all the things that you asked for. When you're working in this toolbar, a word of advice, there's a field option here and a field browser option here. I personally prefer the field option because it pops up in a nice dialog and shows me all of my fields, all of my attributes from Intelligent Advisor. It's easy for me to read. You might notice, for example, that I have these names here. These are the names that I gave to my attributes in Intelligent Advisor. So it comes down to this. Step 1, write some text. Step 2, open the field list. Step 3, select a field, double-click it, and it will show up in your document. Of course, when this is actually delivered to the end user, whatever the value of that attribute is, will be replaced. So it's good old-fashioned mail merge for Intelligent Advisor. I want you to notice up here, however, there's often a cause for confusion. You'll actually see that most attributes appear twice. You've got something called total cost airfare value, which I think we can probably say is the total value of airfare. And then we have total cost airfare text. It's easy to get confused. Ask yourself this question. Do you want to display the value of the attribute, for example, 250? Or do you want to display the text, such as the value of the airfare? You can use both or either, it's up to you. So in my case, I've said I want to display the text. It's most likely that if you use the text that you're also going to want to use the value, so the user will see a label and will see the value. Just my opinion. So far so good. We created a template in Microsoft Word using BI Publisher Desktop. Now what? Well, if you've chosen BI Publisher Desktop, in that toolbar, you have a feature called PDF Preview. So even while you're still working on your template, you can click PDF Preview and you can see what it will look like as a PDF file. So before you give it to your end users, you can see it. One thing that you might notice when you use the PDF preview is that the preview doesn't really conform to your expectations. Let me be more specific. The preview will put sample data in your template, such as 1. So you might see the total cost of the flights is 1. That's not really representative. Plus, it's not very easy to read and get an idea. Does this look right? Is this too long? Is this too big? Basically, the sample data is not really very good. So I'm going to show you a little trick that not everybody knows you can use to make better sample data. I'm going to switch over into the application now, and I'm going to go back to my Oracle Policy Modeling where I was before. And I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go over to my debugger. When you're in the debugger, you are already familiar, I'm sure, with the concept of exporting data. Exporting data for the purposes of recovering it later or for the purposes of making a test case. If I export my test data, so this was Steve, the pilot, who didn't correspond to my criteria. When I close the debugger and I go to my forms list and I decide to create a form, and I'll leave it with its default name, I hope you don't mind. So I've already downloaded BI Publisher Desktop for Office. As you can see, it's going to need me to have installed Microsoft Word. What it means is that when I decide to edit my form, it should open up in Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word at the bottom of the screen. And I want you to notice that there's a BI Publisher toolbar here. And you'll notice a variety of buttons, and we mentioned this earlier: field, conditional format, conditional region, and they're almost all inactivated. That's because you can't really work with this toolbar until you have provided some sample data. So you'll recall a few minutes ago that I actually saved some sample data, at which point you can recover the data. If you don't have any sample data, or you simply can't remember where you put the sample data, be aware that there will always be some basic sample data stored in the folder called Form Templates, ENUS in my case, because that's my project region. So that is the default sample data. If I was to do a PDF preview, I would see that sample data. But as I mentioned a moment ago, if I now go back to debug and I go to export, you'll notice a new option has appeared. Export form data for new form. So if you want to use a debugging session, for example, Steve, who is not authorized to fly the plane and who doesn't satisfy the health criteria, if you want to capture that data and use it while you're building your form, you can export it instead. And I'll put that on the desktop and say, this is Steve. And when I go into my BI Publisher desktop, I can click Sample XML and I can go and get that instead. What that means is, when I go and do my PDF preview or my HTML preview and so on, if I've added some fields, so I'm going to add, for example, let's go and add, I'll get there in the end. Let's go to the sample data. Let's add the sample data file. I always recommend starting off with the standard one, because then you can open the field list and you'll see that I have candidate value, candidate text, home base value, and home base text. So I'll put in candidate value, double click. There's my form field, and I'll put in, at the beginning, I'll say candidate name. If I was now to run the PDF preview, you'll notice that the default example of candidate data 1 is hardly the most realistic sample data I've ever seen. At least it gives you an idea that that's how it works. But if I was to go back to sample data now, go back to my example with Steve, and re-preview, there's no doubt in my mind that if I was building a form and I needed to judge positioning of elements using real-life data, it makes much more sense to be able to refer to that example data. So get in the habit of switching between the standard sample data, which is useful at the beginning when you are positioning, for example, your fields on the page. So I've loaded up the original standard one, and I could now go down here and say, well, what else can I put in? I don't think there was very much else. The home base. I'll put home base text and home base value. Yeah, I know I didn't put a space between them, but that's okay. I'll do that in a minute. I'll put a semicolon, okay? And I'll PDF preview again. Ugh. Home base data 2, clearly not the most useful of sample data. You'll see here the clear difference between the text and the value, because the candidate's home base, I like that. That's the text that appeared in the interview. So now I'll switch to my sample data that included Steve's information. And I'll re-preview again. Steve's home base is Paris. So you see the trap here of using text and value without paying attention to what is the text-based version and what is the value. So think carefully about how you want to display this. So I'll say to you, well, actually, you know what? I quite like that. So I'll remove the home base and I'll remove the semicolon and I'll re-preview. Yeah, that's what my end user is looking for. Candidate name, Steve. Steve's home base is Paris. So I've used the value in the first case and I've used the text in the second. So that was a little digression to help you with the PDF preview idea, the ability to make the preview as lifelike as possible so you can test with real data. It also gave me the opportunity to show you that there's a difference between the text and the value. Choosing the right one can enhance or detract from the quality of the form. The PDF preview button, I beg your pardon, to make that button work requires your computer or your desktop or your laptop to have a couple of extra things installed, notably Java. It's well documented, but it takes a few steps to get that button to work. Anyway, let's move on to further information about forms. You've probably worked this out, is that when I double-clicked a field and added it to my Word document, I added what we would call in Word terminology a form field. And in fact, it's a little bit more than that. It's a specific form field with specific parameters. If I need to go back to Microsoft Word and I need to make adjustments to my document, if I double-click one of my form fields, you'll notice that BI Publisher Properties appears. And I can go back and edit. Perhaps I made a mistake. It's another field. Perhaps it's not text, it's a number, or it's a date, and so on. So I can go back and make minor changes to how the information is displayed. So behind the scenes, behind every one of these, there are some settings that are relevant to BI Publisher and how Intelligent Advisor actually interprets that. The second point is a good one. If you're unfamiliar with form fields in Microsoft Word, BI Publisher generally stores all of the useful information about what you're doing in those form fields. So it's wise to get a little bit more familiar with the concept. Notice this example on the right-hand side. You'll see that this is actually going to do something quite clever. This is what's known as a repeating group. I've said group by for each. So for each expense, I will show the expense and maybe some other data, but I will group by the type. So if I have airfares, car mileage, hotels, and meals, those maybe are 4 expense types. So I'm going to group by expense type and display all of the expenses grouped by type. Trust me, to do that manually would take a long time. So using the BI Publisher toolbar to add a repeating group, and by simply selecting a field and selecting a loop, it saves you a lot of time. And for those of you who are more familiar with formatting and form fields, yes, if you click the Advanced tab, you can see what's happening behind the scenes. So here, for example, you can see that the BI Publisher Properties Advanced tab has been selected, and you can see things like row X value equals yes, attribute, context, color. So this is probably going to be a conditional format because I see reference to a color and I see reference to a condition that says equals yes. And I see an if and an end if. And if you're thinking, gosh, I'm not sure I want to do that myself, I'd much rather do it using BI Publisher, then you don't have to do it this way. You could simply click the Properties tab, which is right there, and fill in the fields rather than having to write it in the Advanced tab. But if you're familiar with BI Publisher, you'll be thinking, great, I can use all my knowledge that I already have and use it in Intelligent Advisor. Notice the last point. You can go a long, long way with this. So hiding behind this functionality, you have the Advanced tab, which lets you natively edit those tags. But you can go even further by leveraging the underlying format that is used by BI Publisher to create very sophisticated layouts and templates and disappearing content and properly aligned tables and so forth. So you can go a long, long way. Now we come back to the subject we broached right at the beginning, is that a good reason to use a form is to provide an explanation. Adding an explanation to your form requires two steps. It requires you to create a form field that contains a template and then a form field that will actually contain the explanation itself. So if you're thinking, hang on, that sounds really complicated, let me make it simple. You go to the online help, you copy and paste an example into your Word document, into a field, and then you create another form field and you copy and paste something else from the documentation. And the only thing you'll probably have to edit is you will have to edit perhaps the name of an attribute so that it knows that you are explaining a particular attribute. Because the code that is given on the online help, for obvious reasons, is generic and you have to populate it with the name of your own field. So here you can see a kind of minimalist walkthrough of using BI Publisher to do something clever. On the right-hand side, step one, I want you to notice, I don't know if you can see it just there, there's a field called Signature Image Data. If your interview includes a signature where the user must sign with their finger or a stylus, and you then build a form based around the same entity, you will see that there is an additional field available to you called Signature Image Data. So you can position that in your Word document. So this is step two, there you are, I've just added it to my document. Then I can customize it. If you can just see here, you'll probably see that it talks about a in-stream foreign object. Without going into any detail, what we're telling Word and BI Publisher is, hang on, this is not a normal attribute. It contains data in a stream. And that stream will need to be converted into an image so that we can put it into the file and show it into the end user. And if you're thinking, I don't need to know this, you're absolutely right. All you need to know is put the signature in your document, add the advanced properties, and your signature will appear in the document exactly as it was when the user signed it. So far, so good. Hopefully, you're quite enthusiastic about what you can use forms to do in your interviews. The final part is, well, how do I actually give it to the end user? Clearly, you need to be able to add a link to your interview. So here's an example. I've created a page called Download PDF, and I've said, click to download. What I've done is I've selected a new control of type form, and I've selected the form, and that's what it looks like. Then I am free to change this. I am also free to change the file type, and I am free to change the file name. You might be wondering why I want to change the file name. Well, you remember the example I gave you of having a family with family members? Well, maybe you want to have each file name that includes the name of the family member. So file Bob, file Janet, file Richard, file Steve. You can use substitution, and I'm sure you can see that right there with the percentage signs. The percentage signs, you'll remember, are used to substitute values in an interview. So you can use this with your files as well. So you can create a unique file name or a robust system for naming files. If you are going to go down the route of having multiple family members, each of which has a file, or in my case, as you can see on screen, multiple expense reports, each of which has an expense detail form, when you're building your screen, make sure that when you drop your form onto the screen, you place it inside the entity that it refers to. So my form here is all about expense, and you'll notice that I've placed it inside the expense entity container, which was already on my page. Basically what I'm saying to you is, if your form is about a particular entity, make sure you place it within that entity on the screen. Otherwise you'll get a warning saying this is in the wrong place. That's not the only way to share the form with the outside world. Consider the following. In a situation where Intelligent Advisor is integrated with Oracle Service Cloud, the end user is perhaps a Service Cloud call center agent, and they are discussing with a customer something on the phone. And they've gone through an interview, the agent has gone through the interview and generated a form. Well, to be honest, the form really should be associated with the customer back in Service Cloud, because it's a reference to the interview that took place over the phone with this customer. So it is possible to, in your connectivity with external applications, to send the data of the form to the external application so that the external application can recover the PDF file or whatever it was. So this would be on the submit button, or a submit and redirect, which is essentially the same thing with a redirect. You could say, okay, when I submit my interview, make sure that this file gets sent back to my application. So this is my form, this is the file name, this is the format, and it's attached to global. So I can fine-tune how this form is sent back to Service Cloud. Two things I need to make clear. One, Service Cloud was just an example. It could be any application that supports the concept of attachments and uses a connection. Two, technically speaking, the attachment is typically sent back either using base64 encoding or a similar encoding, so your application will need to unencode it back into its original file blob so that it can put it in its file system, so that it can store it in as a file. I think I mentioned this earlier when we were speaking about explanations, but it's doubly true now when we talk about forms. Let's take an example of the pilot and the assessment of whether the pilot is ready to pilot our plane. Maybe your interview contains two forms. One which is useful to give to the pilot when they have successfully proved they can fly the plane, and another one which is only useful if they've failed. So once again, you can use the standard interview functionality of show if, hide if, and you can make the right form, so the right link, appear in the interview at the right stage based on other rules and other logic. Similarly, if you've created multiple languages for your forms, if your user has switched to another language and they click your link, they should get that version. They should get the French version or the Italian version or whatever it is. You can also customize in the Interview tab how the file is downloaded in the browser. Does it appear in a separate window, or does it go to the Downloads folder? Stuff like that. So you have fine-grained control over what happens when the user clicks your link. What do I want you to remember? I want you to remember really three things. One, this is about generating a document of some kind. PDF is the most common, but you can actually also switch it to XLS, XL, HTML, XML, or RTF. The creation of the form is done in an external tool, typically Microsoft Word if you're using RTF, or some PDF editor if not. Clearly, if your organization already has BI publisher skills or PDF creation skills, you can leverage that to your advantage. But there is going to be, even then, a little bit of a learning curve to understand how to use Intelligent Advisor attributes in a PDF or RTF context. So we should say that you need a little bit of non-Intelligent Advisor knowledge to get the best out of this. That's it for now. See you in a moment.